Hi, I'm here today with Gibbons, CEO of Bennett Carroll Solicitors. How are you guys?
Hi, good.
I just wanted to ask you a couple of questions about contracts, but particularly deposits. Now, buyers seem to get a bit freaked out when it comes to money, so if you could let us know what would be the best way to structure a deposit.
Sure. We all get a bit freaked out when it comes to money. When you buy a property, it's quite normal for the seller to ask for a deposit. That is a little bit of hurt money and a bit of a hedge to make sure that you go ahead and complete. If the deposit is too small, then the temptation is there for the buyer to say, oh, I really don't want to complete. I have an unconditional contract and I have to complete, but I'm not losing much, so I'll just walk away. So it's essentially the norm that every contract will have a deposit. The buyer puts up a certain percentage of the purchase price, either at the beginning or in stages, and that money is held by the agent, or very rarely the solicitor, for one or other party until completion, and it's released at completion.
Okay. Well, what would be a sufficient amount to pay as a deposit?
Well, this is an interesting point these days with property prices the way that they are. It was always traditionally 10% of the purchase price, but that can be a really significant sum now, with properties fetching around or over $1 million in most capital cities. So having to find 100,000 plus as a deposit is pretty difficult. So these days it's more common to see 5% or a set amount which is enough that the buyer won't walk away. And that can often be paid in stages. So it might be a couple of $1,000 when the contract is signed, and then the balance when building pest or finance is approved. So when the contract becomes an unconditional contract, the balance of the money gets paid.
Okay. Now, if I don't have the cash readily available, could I use a deposit bond?
Yes, deposit bonds have become fairly common these days. Some vendors are not very happy with deposit bonds, but essentially the buyer goes off to the financier and gets a document which is, well, you should think of it as a blank cheque, which is to be held by the seller or by the agent. So the deposit bond is, generally speaking, it's a promise to pay. So if the buyer goes into default and the deposit is triggered to be released or forfeited to the seller takes that deposit bond down to the financier and the financier exchanges it for money, no questions asked. The advantage for the buyer is that you pay a small fee to keep that facility open during the life of the contract, but you actually don't have to stump up with the entire deposit amount, which is a bit of an advantage if you're strapped for cash and you're hoping to borrow the entire purchase price.
Definitely. Now, if I'm not going to be proceeding with my contract for any reason, how do I go about getting my deposit back?
Okay, sometimes there are disputes over deposits, and it's a bit of a bun fight, particularly in Queensland, where the agent usually holds the deposit, and the agent will get a demand from one party saying, I'm entitled to my deposit back, and a demand from the other party saying, no, I'm entitled to that deposit, or don't release that deposit, Mr. Agent, or we'll sue you because we're going to have an argument about it. The agent, of course, says, well, I'm not touching this, the deposit stays where it is. If the contract is terminated through no fault of the buyer's entitled to his deposit back. If the contract is terminated where there is default of the buyer, then the seller has the option to forfeit the deposit. In other words, to get the deposit paid to him, the seller. If the buyer, for example, has an unconditional contract and the day before settlement says, I can't settle for whatever reason, the buyer is entitled, provided they do it the right way, to kill off that contract and claim the deposit. It has a whole heap of other rights as well, but then you write to the agent, or your solicitor writes to the agent and says, this is what's happened, please release the deposit to me. The agent will always go to the other side and say, is that right? And this is where the disputes often come in. So that can be a bit contentious, but if your solicitor's done their job properly and all of the documentation is in place, that deposit can and should be released.
Okay, now if we have any more questions or any information we need, where can we contact you?
The number of the firm is 1300 334 566. You can go to our website, which is bcglaw.com. There's any additional information there. Or if you're buying or selling, just simply say to the agent that you're using Bennett Carroll for the conveyance. They'll put our details on the contract and we'll contact you from there.
Okay, great. Thank you very much.